So in this segment, we're going to be talking about Labour retreating from its pledge to nationalise energy, water and mail if it wins the next election. So this is pretty tragic stuff here. So Labour has abandoned to nationalise key industries if it wins the next election, the Shadow Chancellor has confirmed. And this is not surprising that Reeves said Labour would not nationalise these industries, including rail, back in 2022. So it seems they're still confused on what they actually want to do. Reeves suggesting that the railway were the only sector in line to be taken over by the state, even as she pushes for action to bring industrial supply chains back to the UK. So last year, she said they would not nationalise rail. This year, they claim they will. Can they make up their minds, please? It's not that hard. Like, what are they going to bring to conference when they're asked what will they do? They will do? Are they going to perhaps say we will improve things? Like a puzzle of some sort, like we're going to improve some things but not nationalise things. What is going on here? We're for good things and against bad things. Are they the DNC party from America? Nationalising other businesses such as energy firms, water companies and the Royal Mail is no longer on the agenda. By contrast, rail is the easiest one because of the way the contracts are set up, but to argue that this is down to fiscal costs makes no sense. Perhaps if we brought out one of the failing companies instead of offering bailouts to them, it would make more sense, but I don't know. Before the last general election, Labour had proposed nationalising all of these industries, and Keir Starmer said during his own leadership campaign that they should be taken into, quote, common ownership. And what does common ownership mean? Like, we can buy shares in these companies. Is that common ownership? Dude made no sense. Speaking at a manufacturing conference hosted by an industry group, Make UK, Reeves said Labour's goal was to, quote, to prize economic resilience alongside openness, end quote, by encouraging firms to set up British supply chains rather than using supplies from overseas, which may prove to be unreliable in a crisis. And sure, that's great and all, but why would they set up in the UK when the UK does not produce a lot of raw materials, which means we have to import them, which has become more expensive thanks to Brexit? So how will you encourage companies to set up their supply chains here? Are you going to offer subsidies because other countries are? What's the plan here? We already know that Jaguar Land Rover have asked for £500 million to set up a battery factory here. So, are you going to offer subsidies? What's the play? Asked by The Eye whether she would press ahead with the nationalisation to further this promise, the Shadow Chancellor replied, quote, "It's not about nationalising industries. I've been very clear that every pound of taxpayers' money spent, we will explain where that money will come from," end quote. So Labour are so desperate to tell people they will be fiscally responsible, but fail to understand you don't run a country like a household budget. That's been tried and failed. Look at the Geddes Acts, for example. Instead, you actually talk about one of Britain's great economists, John Maynard Keynes. But I guess Labour will continue to fail to explain things to people and leave it to the Tories and the right-wing press to explain it to them. It's a bold strategy. It's really tragic we don't use one of Britain's great economists, genuinely great economists. Instead, we fall back on classic neoliberal nonsense. She says, quote, I think with trains it's a bit different, or it's a different point, because as those contracts come up for renewal, I think the government have got every right to bring those into national control, given the mess around some of our train operators that have made our transport infrastructure. But we would not be looking to nationalise a whole swathe of industries, end quote. Miss Reeves urged Jeremy Hunt not to listen to Conservative backbenchers who are urging him to corporation tax, insisting that a better approach would be to introduce targeted tax breaks for companies which agree to reinvest their profits in the UK. We'll go on to that in a bit, but with the trains, I think it's fine, if they want to nationalise them in this way. But the problem is, given that France, Emmanuel Macron, who was seen, I think, as he's a former banker, he's got kind of a stigma around him. But, France are going out their way to nationalise EDF by buying out the shareholders. And so fiscally, evidently it makes sense for them to do so. So for them to make fiscal arguments on this case makes no sense. When you had Starmer saying we're going to bring things into common ownership, and then say, because of the economy changing, because of COVID, that's changed. We do need to remember that the NHS was built on debt. We had to borrow a lot of money, predominantly from America, to get the NHS done, and fiscally it was the right thing to do, despite it putting us into massive debt. So it's not about debt being good or bad, it's about what you do with the money. You can borrow money for tax cuts and implode the economy, or you can borrow the money to, say, nationalize one of the big energy providers and bring that into, kind of government control and use that to really help people. It just depends. So, these kind of arguments they're making about fiscal responsibility, that sounds great to people who understand nothing about economics. But in order to make an actual difference to people's lives, you have to be bold here. And what she's arguing is nonsense. But perhaps, if I was going to be very generous here, Labour will argue, once they bring the trains into line, that they can say, look, we've done a great job with the trains, how about we go to, say, water, for example, or for energy. So it could make sense, but it's very long and very slow. And that's only if they're actually going to do that. I was being very generous if you missed that bit. About the tax cuts, Reeve said she would, quote, prioritise incentives to support investment, because if businesses make profits, I want businesses to make profits. It's up to them what to do with those profits, to use those profits for share buybacks or dividends, or use that money to invest. It's the investment that I want to encourage and incentivise, because it's investment that results in productivity gains and economic growth. That is what we desperately need in Britain, end quote. And I don't think it's just down to profits and reinvestment where the country benefits. It's down to people having more disposable income. But sure, I think she was a former economist at the Bank of England. I'm just some noob on YouTube. So, maybe we'll defer to her expertise, but it's in doubt. How do you know which companies are actually looking to reinvest profits into the country versus the ones doing buybacks and dividends? I get that information is public in most public traded companies, but I'm talking about how the money is spent. So say a company spends 30% of their money on reinvesting in the company, spending that money how Labour wants them to spend it, then 60% on dividends, and then 10% on stock buybacks. You're introducing more red tape for these companies to claim tax relief. How exactly is the split going to work? She also called for a review for the business rates regime to lower rates on, quote, brick and mortar businesses, end quote, and shift the burden towards firms that operate online. Again, that's fine, but a lot of stores have brick and mortar stores as well as online stores. How do you deal with that in terms of business rates? The Shadow Chancellor insisted that it would be possible to make improvements to the UK's trade deal with the EU, saying, quote, we would work with our neighbours and our allies to make practical changes, not going back into the single market or the customs union, but changes we can make at pace to improve exports and get investments back into Britain, end quote. So, given that the red tape has pushed more companies into setting up shop in the EU, your plan would not resolve that. You can make some changes, but the scale of the issue here is not something you know how to resolve. Labour are so desperate to appeal to certain people, mortgage ban. But if Labour win the next election and don't produce results because of their C-tier policies and their D-rank politicians, I would be concerned. I would look at making corporation tax rates closer to, say, the income tax rates, in terms of creating a bracket where you would pay no corporation tax if you, say, make below £10,000, for example. You can pull out any number. That number is not important, but it'll allow small businesses to keep more of their money into the next year. But it's not my area of expertise. But at least then it'd create kind of less red tape for them, and they can keep that money and decide to reinvest it. When you look at the kind of corporation tax rates, small profits rates, companies with under £50,000, they have to pay 19% in corporation tax. That's on the entire 50,000, and then it moves up to companies making over 250,000, 25%. So it's a bit weird the way they framed it here. But I would say create a bracket where you don't have to pay tax, and those companies will most likely reinvest that money anyways because they're small businesses back into the company, or they'll keep it for a rainy day, which also makes sense. But again, it's not, what I'm saying is not based in any expertise here. This is just based on how I think they should change corporation tax. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think of Labour's C-tier policies. Hit the like button, comment, subscribe, all of that kind of stuff. Support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.